to introduce Karen Parker on our panel today. I'm going to let her introduce the two gentlemen on either side of her. Karen was the first African-American woman to receive an undergraduate degree here at Carolina. She's had a long and distinguished career as a journalist, including 15 years in the Los Angeles Times and 14 years Winston-Salem Journal. She retired there in 2010. She served on our board of directors for the GAA maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and she's now in the Journalism Hall of Fame. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Karen and get the program started.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to introduce these other gentlemen. I know both of them from way back when. Mickey, the Reverend Dr. Michael C. Blackwell. Actually, he is a longtime friend of 52 years, going back to 1963, if my math is right. Mickey was one of the first people to befriend me when I came here, when there were very few people volunteering to befriend me. And he was there. I used to call him my big brother. And we used to look alike, but I started to hang out in the tanning salon. Mickey, for 32 years, has been the president of Baptist Children's Homes of North Carolina and doing a wonderful, wonderful job there. He is also the author of 4 books, and there is a biography that's been written about him called Just Call Me Mickey, and it is in the North Carolina collection at Wilson Library. And Mickey's going to go first. But, and he's also star of radio, screen, stage, and television. Actually, just radio and television. And here is Jim Wallace. I have also known him almost as long as I've known Mickey. What he and Mickey have in common was they covered the sit-ins and the civil rights demonstrations that were going on there. As Mickey pointed out to me, he wrote the stories, Jim took the pictures, and I went to jail. Jim has had a long and distinguished career as a photographer. He retired as Director of Curator, Imaging, Printing, and Photographic Services at the Smithsonian Institution. And he was in charge of a staff of photographers to make sure they got everything right. And he is the author of a book, a very fine book called Courage in the Moment. And he covered his photographs of the Chapel Hill sit-ins and demonstrations are covered in that book, as well as an encounter with the Ku Klux Klan, which I'm sure he was thrilled about. So Jim's done a lot of things. I'm looking at his resume. Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn over to Mickey. Mickey's going to give you some background on the speaker ban law that was going on in our day and time that some people may not know about. So, Mickey Blackwell.
Tuesday, June 25th, 1963, dawned like any other day in downtown Raleigh. It was a bit overcast, but there was a darker cloud over the town that day because there were some agitated men. They were agitated because it was the last day of the General Assembly. They were tired, exhausted really. But one of the reasons that they were agitated was because they had seen some professors dare to walk with civil rights demonstrators. And these men, mostly because of the day and age, segregationists and almost all Democrats, decided they wanted to do something about it. Because they thought these men who were marching, Al Lowenstein and others, were communist sympathizers. And so they said, even in the waning days, the last day of the legislature, we want to do something about it. Now, these men gathered at the epicenter of power, the Sir Walter Hotel. Not 116 East Jones Street, but the Sir Walter Hotel, where they all lived during the session. And over in this corner here, you could see some of the leaders like Phil Godwin and Clarence Stone begin to huddle. And then over in another corner, you could see somebody in bespectacled glasses who campaigned in 1936 for Secretary of State with the theme saying, "Give a young man a chance." But now this man was no longer a young man, and he had been drafted, so to speak, to write this speaker ban law. His name, of course, was Thad Ewart, and he was one who had several distinctions. He called himself the oldest rat in the Democratic barn. He said his office door never ever would be closed, and he always said he had to hire a beautiful, young, unmarried female to be his secretary and receptionist outside his door in the state capitol. He was a man every year who went western North Carolina to preside at the Ramp Festival, and he would sit and eat raw ramps and say, these are so very, very good. Thad Ewart was a man to contend with, and he wrote that bill, which was basically entitled An Act to Regulate Visiting Speakers at State-Supported Colleges and Universities. It is known by various names, the Speaker Ban Law or the Gag Law, and it was rushed through in record time. Parliamentary procedure was thrown out the window. There was about a 23-minute window, and this bill became law. It was decided upon there in the Sir Walter Hotel that these men would present this on the last day of the legislative session. Now, there were a couple of people there who were truly friends of the university, and even though they did not have much notice, one of them placed a call to President William Friday. He answered the phone himself. It was like a jangling of the telephone, and Bill Friday picked up the phone and someone said, "Mr. President, you need to get to Raleigh and the legislative building as soon as you possibly can because some dangerous things are about to happen." Bill Friday quickly hung the phone up, got in his Chevrolet, headed down Highway 54, and perhaps for the first time in his life broke the speed limit trying to get to Raleigh. But it was too late. That bill had already become a law. That was a tough time for Bill Friday. He had to make some stops on the way back, and one of them was to his good friend Terry Sanford, there at the governor's mansion. Terry Sanford was infuriated about this passage in such record time because he saw it, as a threat to academic freedom, but really infuriated because he could not do anything about it. For Terry Sanford was the only governor in the United States who did not have the veto power. And he chafed under that for all of his governorship and the fact that the governor could not succeed himself, something that really was not rectified until Jim Hunt was governor. So Bill Friday made a long, hard trip back home. And perhaps the most difficult visit that he had to make when he got back home was to his good friend William Aycock, who at that time was the chancellor here, and who was the man who was going to carry the bricks, as it were, in the fight against this law. Now, if you can imagine what it was like on that last day and how the rules had been suspended and the readings had taken place, 3 readings of the bill. Yeah, they followed the law, but But they did it in 5 minutes. They read it, they read it, they read it. And when the time came for the vote, something that continued in legislative lore for several years, the presiding officer in the Senate, Clarence Stone, took his glasses off and said, "I don't believe I see any further discussion on this bill. All in favor say aye, all opposed no, the bill has passed and now becomes law." Took off his glasses and didn't see nobody. Which was exactly the point. Well, it took a while for everything to really register back here in Chapel Hill. And make no mistake about it, the object of this law was Chapel Hill. It was not State College. It was not Woman's College. It was the third branch of the Consolidated University right here in Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill, not NC State, or State College as it was called at the time, if you wanted to speak nicely of it. Or College in Greensboro. And another reason, by the way, that Terry Sanford was really ticked off about this, in those days the Consolidated University had 100 members on its board of trustees, and the governor was the chair of the entire board of trustees. So they came back. Bill Aycock got word. Now, some of you, when you knew Chancellor Aycock, and man, he was one who was a firebrand. He wanted to make sure that Bill Friday stayed protected, and he carried a lot of the bricks there in the early days. The faculty had to decide what they were going to do. Were they going to take a stand, or were they going to kind of finesse it and see what happened? I had the privilege of being the Chapel Hill correspondent for the Charlotte Observer during my senior year, your junior year. That was a great experience for me. And I have an article here that came out in October 1963. Now remember that the law passed in June of 1963. By Mickey Blackwell, Carolina's News Service of the Observer. University of North Carolina faculty members had mixed reactions on Monday to a speech in which Pulitzer Prize-winning author Paul Green of Chapel Hill accused them of not speaking out against the so-called Speaker Gag Law. The Gag Law is a bill passed in the last days of the regular session of the 1963 General Assembly. It prohibits communists or persons who have taken the Fifth Amendment in loyalty cases from speaking on university property. Green said Monday, professors and researchers are busy discovering and searching for truth, but they do darn little to see if that truth prevails in our society. And then one of the faculty spokesmen had this to say, Arnold Nash, Mr. Green cannot prove that the faculty is not doing something about it. What he means is that the faculty isn't making a great noise about it. Well, that was in October of '63. And then a little bit later on, October 29, '63, opposition unanimous in the council. Big headline in the Charlotte Observer, and Bill Aycock and Bill Friday both expressed appreciation that I wrote about it, and that the Charlotte Observer gave it big play. Opposition unanimous in council resolution will go to trustees by Mickey Blackwell, Observer, Carolina News Service. The University of North Carolina faculty members spoke out strongly for academic freedom Tuesday by voting to oppose the law banning communist speakers. The 75-member faculty council in a closed-door meeting voted unanimously to oppose the speaker ban law in a resolution to be presented to the board. A strongly worded, quote-unquote, resolution that was designed to educate rather than agitate. All right, enter Bill Friday. After President Friday had a meeting that very day that he came back from Chapel Hill with Bill Aycock, Bill Aycock decided it was going to be his charge, his mantle, his responsibility to speak out, and speak out with great fervor the speaker ban law. Here is an article that appeared in the Charlotte Observer on Sunday, November 10th, 1963. UNC Chancellor calls red gag law insult. He calls it sloppy legislation. Let's see who wrote that. Oh, by Mickey Blackwell. University of North Carolina Chancellor William B. Aycock launched a blistering attack upon the speaker gag law Saturday, calling it a stigma, an insult, and a limitation upon higher education. In the most forceful pronouncement the Chancellor has ever made on the law, he told an audience of UNC alumni and others that the university would rather have their time in fighting the law rather than their money. Now, he's speaking at the annual meeting of the UNC Alumni Board of Directors, and he said this law is full of ambiguities and calls it the sloppiest bit of legislation that I have ever seen or heard of. It was the poorest drafted legislation that I have ever seen of, and is the most serious challenge to the university since the Monkey Bill of the 1920s. Then he says, I can assure you there was no need for such a law. There is no evidence on any of UNC's 3 campuses to indicate any need for such a law that takes basic fundamental rights from the university. That was November 10, 1963. That very month, things changed forever for us. And there wasn't much talk about the speaker ban law because you know what happened, and you know where you were around 1 o'clock on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. But the mantle was never put down. Even though things kind of got quiet after a while, things still began to move, even though they began to move kind of slowly. Shortly after you graduated, somewhere around June 16, 1965, the Brit Commission was established, and that was to begin to study the whole thing. Then, in February 19, 1968, the speaker ban law was overturned. That was in 1968, speaker ban law overturned. Take a breath. May 17, the law was repealed. May 17, 1995. It took a long time for those wheels to move slowly. Well, our class was involved in a lot of the civil rights demonstrations, as you'll hear shortly. Other people began to pick up the mantle. Bill Aycock retired. A guy named Paul Sharp was your chancellor. He was only here for a couple of years. He didn't quite jive with Bill Friday, and you know, that didn't quite work out the way they would like. But we had student leaders that picked up the mantle. People like Hugh Stevens, people like Bob Spearman. And they began to look at it, and they began to see the wrong of it. And then finally, one guy named Paul Dixon, who was the president of the student body, began to meet with Bill Friday. Bill Friday was so careful. He would not even meet on university property with Paul Dixon. He'd go out to the wall in front of his house, not university property, to discuss what needed to be done. And so they began to hire some lawyers, and they began to say, this is what we need to do. And it eventually led to this thing being declared unconstitutional. All hail the name Paul Dixon. Did such a wonderful, wonderful job. It was a threat to academic freedom. J.B.S. Haldane, who was a prominent geneticist, used to be with the Communist Party but resigned. He was the first victim of the speaker ban law, and it was the only time that I got an 8-banner headline in the Charlotte Observer. That was such a significant, significant story. But there were others. The university said, do you have any affiliation? And he just would not answer, and so the university had to say to this prominent man, you cannot come here. It was a pivotal time, it was a crucial time, but thank goodness with time and patience and changing mores, changing values, and changing culture, this law was declared unconstitutional, and the threat to academic freedom was pushed away once and for all, at least at that time. That is the Speaker Banwell.
Jim Wallace will take over from there.
After we're done, I hope you'll take time to come down and look at the photographs. I donated these photographs to the Wilson Library. I intend to donate more of the photographs that I took for the Daily Tar Heel. My point being that all of these photographs were taken for the Daily Tar Heel. I did a little bit of freelance work for the Charlotte Observer and UPI, but all of these photographs were taken for the Daily Tar Heel. Because the Tar Heel had taken an editorial stand during the sit-ins and during the marches in favor of a public accommodations law being passed in Chapel Hill. Why did the newspaper do that? Is Hugh Stevens here? Hugh was the last editor that I worked for. Anybody else who worked on the Tar Heel here? I see 3 or 4 hands, so I better get it right. Beginning back with Wayne King, the Tar Heel staff and editorial decisions said that if every student can't walk across Franklin Street and go into any store and eat lunch, that's not right. And so from Wayne King, Jim Wallace, Gary Blanchard, Dave Etheridge, Hugh Stevens.
They set the tone, and they were heroes all along.
And so all of them pointed to me and said, go out on the road and bring back photographs. All of these were not published in the Tar Heel. We only printed 4 pages a day, and there were some other things going on campus. But over a period of time, and I'll talk to you about 1 or 2 of these photographs, I ended up spending so much time working on the Tar Heel that I almost graduated with the class of '65. I graduated from the second summer session in '64, and frankly, I needed 2 B's in my final exams in order to graduate. I did it the hard way. I got an A and a C. But as a result, we spent a lot of time publishing the tabloid version of the Tar Heel that came out once a week. And this photograph, the one with the flag, I forget who the summer editor was that year, but they wanted a 4th of July picture. And 4th of July pictures are usually people sitting around eating hot dogs and watching fireworks. And there was a march down Franklin Street that day, and this is the 4th of July picture that I brought back. And it ran. I also want to talk to you about this photograph, the cop in the white helmet. For reasons that I only discovered a couple of years ago, let me come in front of the police lines. so that if you see a photograph inside the jail building and other places, it was because Lindy Pendergrass, who later became sheriff of Orange County, let me in. And it wasn't until I was working on the book that I came down because I wanted to get names for the police that are shown. And I asked him why he gave you that access. And he said, we knew that you had lunch at Harry's with the people who were planning the next marching sit-in, and that they had told you where it was going to be. And so I followed you. This photograph is taken at Woolen Gym. It's the day of the Wake Forest basketball game. And when the game was over with, there was a sit-in in front of the only exit to the parking lot, and nobody could get out. And when you come up, you can see the frustrated look on the woman's face who is in that car. The student being dragged by one arm was Joanne Johnson, who later on became Karen's roommate. This was taken at Brady's restaurant. And one of the things that have always made me feel good is that, and this ran in the paper, was that when Chief Blake, who was the chief of police in Chapel Hill, saw this photograph, he gathered his officers together and told them never to do that again, and ordered that whenever they arrested somebody, to have 2 officers carry the people. And so we know that things can change. The other photographs that are here, this was Franklin Street, right at the crossing, and the only way that I could get a good picture that way was to talk my way into somebody's room in BBT, and sort of brushed by him and leaned out the window and shot pictures and left. You will see some pictures of the Ku Klux Klan rally. I was not alone. Mickey was with me. He had the car. We actually got, on the summer Tar Heel, we actually got a news release saying that the Klan was going to hold a rally at the intersection of Interstate 40 and 54 here. And it was a recruiting rally. And so for reasons that have eluded Mickey and I to this day, we went. It said that the state police were going to be directing traffic and parking, and so we figured if the state police were there, it was probably going to be okay. Well, when we got there wasn't state police in sight, but there was a bunch of people in military-like uniforms. I swear they were brown shirts. And they questioned us. Who were we and what were we doing? I had a camera around my neck. I always had a camera around my neck. And we told them. And they sort of huddled off to the side and eventually came back and basically turned us loose. And so you will see some photographs here that show faces and whatnot. And it was not for years, again, that I figured out the reason that they probably let me do that. Because, of course, my ID said Jim Wallace. As governor of Alabama, was George Wallace. And they probably figured that we were somehow related. By the way, I can tell you that I'm not related of Alabama. He told me so himself. In this area, speaking before the White Citizens Council. White Citizens Council is sort of the plan in daylight. He spoke at Duke University. And I went over, and as I have done to this day, when I still photograph speakers of the National Press Club, I get a seat up front. And after he finished speaking, half of the audience stood up, linked arms, and started singing, "We Shall Overcome." And this was before all of the assassinations and shootings. And he had 6 Alabama State policemen in 2 cars with him. And they formed a corridor, 3 on each side, and walked off the stage and down underneath what we call the green room. And when they walked past me, I just fell in line as the last person and walked down there. I figured I've been thrown out of better places. And I figured they weren't going to do anything rash, you know, in the main auditorium at Duke University, except to throw me out. Well, they got in and closed the door, and I'm the only one in the room he doesn't know. And so he gets up and walks over and extends his hand, and I can't do the accent very good, but he says, "I'm George Wallace." And I said, "Nice to meet you, sir. I'm Jim Wallace." And he looks at me and he says, "Where's your kin from, boy?" And I told him I had a great-grandfather, who, by the way, graduated in pharmacy from Chapel Hill. And he said, "We're not related. I didn't have any kin in Mississippi," which is where my great-grandfather was from. The Klan pictures are probably the more dramatic of the pictures that are up here, but they are not the most important pictures. The Klan pictures show sort of a futile attempt to take back the old ways. The things that I think are important are pictures like this. Church rallies. People standing outside of segregated restaurants and sitting in. Because I want you to notice something when you come up and look at them. You will see students. You will see older men and women. You will not see working-age black men, because they had all been told that if they took part in the demonstrations, they were going to lose their jobs. That included people working at the Carolina Inn in Lenore Hall. And so, by the way, this was Colonial Drug. It's a wine bar now. significance is that it was people that are photographed here. Unfortunately, I never photographed Karen. But who had the courage. And again, you need to remember, we weren't talking about voting rights, we weren't talking about housing, we weren't talking about jobs, we were talking about eating hamburgers. Most of them second rate. And in one of the programs, if you were there yesterday, over at Keenan Stadium, where they were talking about how are we going back because of trying to take voting rights away, and look at what has happened in Ferguson and look at what has happened in Baltimore. And I want you to remember that what the goal was here was literally to be able to eat breakfast at Sutton's drugstore. Period. The board of in Chapel Hill did not pass the public accommodations law. It failed by, as I recall, one vote, twice. And so it was not until after the March on Washington in the fall of 1964, which I also photographed. And Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that all of the final restaurants in Chapel Hill integrated. People who led the movement at that time felt like they had failed. And I told this story to a gentleman in Washington, Lonnie Bunch. Dr. Bunch is the head of the Smithsonian's newest museum that is rising out of the ground near the Washington Monument, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is due to open in another year or so. And by the way, we'll be using some of these photographs. Lonnie Bunch and I were, when I headed photographers and he was doing political history, we did some things without having work orders. And so after that opens, you will want to see it. I mean, it has a railway car that is divided, and numerous other things. And I told Lonnie that the leadership here felt like they had failed. He said they did not. He said that part of the movement started in Greensboro, and by the way, the Smithsonian has 3 of the stools from the drugstore. And he said it was small movements like Chapel Hill and other places throughout North Carolina and throughout the South that eventually led to the March on Washington, and the March on Washington led to Lyndon Johnson signing the bill. And he said that without the groundswell movements, like in North Carolina and in Chapel Hill, that would not have happened the way that it did. And so I invite you to take a look at these photographs. As I said, they are all in the Wilson Library. There will be some more. I discovered them several years back. And the idea of writing a book was given to me by a friend of mine at the National Press Club, a guy named Paul Dixon, not the Paul Dixon who was president of the student body here. But he saw these photographs and put me in touch with Dover Publishing. And show over there, but I'll tell you, you can pick up a copy if you look out below. But it was basically done for the Daily Tar Heel. It showed leadership in terms of supporting the public accommodations. And so you need to not just look at the photographs, but thank you, Stevens and others, for continuing that. Thank you very much.
Going to talk about is going to jail. I have written about that. It's in our Yakety Yak, our 50th reunion Yakety Yak. There are some other jailbirds in here. I see Charles Thompson over there. I see Otto White back there. Another one. Any more jailbirds? Oh, wow. Okay. After I got arrested, I came up before the Women's Honor Council for not being in the dorm. They had rules back in those days. You had to get in the dorm by, what is it, 10:30 or something? 11. And they locked the door. They locked you in for the night. And you couldn't come out until 6 o'clock the next morning. And nobody could come in, of course. So they were going on about my being out, and they couldn't get away from the fact that I was in jail. And I told them, I said, I called the house mother, I told her I was in jail. And I wouldn't be there. And I also was not exactly having a good time. And you knew where I was. And they kept saying it was a problem getting it confused with civil rights. And they had quite a quandary. They felt that if any vote they took for or against me would be have to do with civil rights. Would be for or against civil rights. And they didn't want to get into that. So what happened was, I would have to read this from having written it down. They called a mistrial on the basis of inadequate procedure, lack of communication between the Attorney General, the investigator, and the defense counsel. That was the end of that. You know, they were going to try all of us. After that, they didn't bother with anybody else. Another strike, I got to correct something and elaborate on something. We had those demonstrations where we blocked intersections. Otto and I were in the same intersection at Columbia and Franklin, and were arrested there. Joanne, that's this woman right here. And this picture has become her legacy, whether she wants it or not. That's Joanne. We were both journalism majors, and we started chatting one day, and we both had been at Women's College, and we also both had been in demonstrations up there. And Jo and I, we had a lot of things in common. And one day, we discovered that we were in Cobb dorm. She had been squeezed into a room with 2 other girls. And I was in a room by myself with an empty bed. So she said, gee, you got an empty bed. Why don't I move in here? We get along fine. I said, cool. Yeah. So she moved in. Well, sometime later, and I have to correct the record, because we gave this talk last year. I gave this talk last year. I said that things hit the fan when her parents met me, and Jo says that's not so. But neither one of us can remember how it hit the fan, but it certainly did, and the administration was not happy that she moved in with me. They couldn't make her move out, but they charged her with illegal moves. And she was on campus for 2 weeks. If there's anybody here who doesn't know what that means, it means that you could not go off the campus for 2 weeks. You could go to class and things on the campus, but you could not go anywhere else. No Franklin Street. Joe has been a good friend of mine over the years. Matter of fact, she lives in Tacoma, Washington. This year, some of the girls in Cobb Dorm, we got together and had our 50th anniversary on an island in Puget Sound in a beach house. We came up in the world. And we've had some previous reunions, one in Chapel Hill in 2008. Pat Thompson, one of the participants, her husband Charles. I don't know if there are any other the people in there. But anyway, it's a great group. I am not going to go on about anything else. I am going to turn it over to questions because I think that sometimes we find out more information from questions than anything else. So let's open it up to, well, yes.
I have two questions. I'm wondering what happened to Charlie Jones, the preacher at the Presbyterian Church when I was here in 1947. That's one question. The other question is everyone here familiar with the group, the Fund for an Open Society, headed by a black man and a white man, designed to promote racial mixes and income mixes in neighborhoods across America?
What year was that?
That's going on now, the Fund for an Open Society.
Very good. I think that's information for a lot of us. I certainly didn't know that. Thank you very much. I don't know what happened to Charlie Jones. Did you know him?
Yes, I did. And I thought I had a photograph of him, and everybody I showed the picture to said it wasn't, but I don't know who it is. One of these days I'm going to bring it back down here. I would like to add that when I was doing the book, I went back to St. Joseph's Church at Scarborough, where most of the marches formed up and started. And they had an open house for me, and we put these photographs up on the wall, and the parishioners there in the Baptist church spent the afternoon walking through, circling heads and drawing names out. And so that was the IDs that you see. And I have the name of the book there too. A younger guy came up to an older woman who was circling and asked her, "What did you do during the struggle?" So that's why you do not see civil rights demonstration on the cover of the book. It is the civil rights struggle.
Very good. Thank you. The other?
For Jim, did you take the picture of Father Clarence Parker that ran in the deadly car deal? It showed him being carried out. He was in his 80s, I think, or maybe even 90s. But he was being carried by two policemen, and the caption was, "Easy, boys, I've got a heart condition."
I think I probably did, but that's one that I haven't gotten around to scanning.
Okay.
Oh, I want to add, if you want to know why, some people don't know why all these people were on the ground. That was part of the tactic for the demonstrations. As soon as we were arrested, then we were told that we were arrested, we would drop to the ground and become dead weight, and we would force them to carry us to jail. So that's why you see people on the ground there. Yeah, back there.
I just want to give credit where credit is due. I was a sports writer on the Target in the early 50s. Editor of the Target seems like about 10 years before what you all are talking about. Charles Carroll, who you all know, was very prominent in his editorials years before, again, what you're speaking of. And he stepped out and was very pro-integration. He made it very clear, and he stood for that at that time and for the rest of his life. And I think you all should know that, and you probably do. And so we owe a great deal to him here at the university for starting or at least initiating this whole, struggle. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the information. What is your name, sir?
Marshall Waldman from Miami, Florida.
Okay, thank you very
This is my
much.
second home.
Yeah, I don't, back there.
Yeah, I just would share a note with respect to the sitting at Columbia after the Wick Park game. I've been arrested several times in Durham. I had a sister who was going to North Carolina Central, and they were picking Howard Johnson on 5501. And we were going to call, and several of us would get into a Renault. Lester Carson had it. It was another journalist who had a Renault that thing. Get 5, 6 guys in a Renault. And go to Durham and get arrested for the demonstration. In Durham, they would process us fairly quickly. And so when we had the demonstration here in Chapel Hill, and we went and we were arrested at Franklin in Columbia, I thought we were going to be processed right away. You know, the jail was on Rosemary Street, the old courthouse. However, they took us to Hillsborough, and I had a chemistry exam the next day. I was still in jail at the time the exam came. Okay, and so that was an experience that I said, maybe I can march, print signs, do everything, but going to jail is not good.
What happened with the chemistry exam?
Oh, I was able to take another exam.
And you actually did graduate. I know that. Thank you, Adam. Yes.
There's a flip side to that story. I was a graduate student at the time, and the judge for Orange County, you guys went to Hillsborough, declared that everybody who was arrested had to go out there every day for their case. That included Blackwell. And I got to which of my teaching career, because I got to teach courses that I couldn't possibly have otherwise.
It was a very interesting time then.
At the risk of boring, there were other factors involved. I remember that when I was in Hillsborough for arraignment, Professor Nagelson, Maurice Nagelson, of the philosophy department, was being questioned as a potential juror, and they asked about his attitude, and he said, well, actually, I'm in sympathy with the demonstrators. And I thought, all right, this is, we're not alone here.
Every time we found people, when we realized we're not alone, a lot of the courageous people at the Daily Tar Heel went along with us or were sympathetic to us, and that helped a lot too. There gentleman there, the first one, the one right behind you. You go, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about the extent of support among Morgan students and faculty across the board, because when they were talking, it was very supportive, and was it kind of like just that, or was there broad support?
I'll tell you, it was not broad support. I know the students were not coming out, the typical UNC students were not coming out and demonstrating against us or anything. They just pretty much ignored us as a rule. A lot of white students came out and were arrested with us. Some others weren't arrested, but they participated in demonstrations and other sympathetic things. Faculty members, we had several, some of whom did not get arrested, but some did. And one by the name of Al Ammons was beaten severely at a demonstration, died years later of a brain aneurysm. And we believe, we don't know, but we believe it was a result of that severe beating to the head he took then. I can just only tell you my personal experience. It was definitely not supported by the student body. And there were faculty members who participated, but there was no statement from anybody related to the university that they were in support of this, other than the Daily Tar Heel.
Well, I lived in Everett dorm, and Sam Shapiro, class of 63, was sort of the president of Everett, and we went to the Pines. Everybody remember the Pines restaurant? We went to the Pines and picketed. We never got arrested or anything. We never got killed. Throwing things at us with moving vehicles. But we picketed the Pines with a bunch of white guys out there marching with our signs, dodging Coke bottles.
Another very brave person, and we were very thankful for the brave people.
This is for Mickey. Do you remember much about the Herbert Aptheker event down on the wall on Franklin Street?
Yes. Yeah, and I think I do. And Bill Walker, were you there for that? There are some iconic pictures about that with the wall, and I think there were 3 people on this side of the wall. And one of them was Bill Walker, if I remember correctly, with your WCHL recorder. You want to say a word about that, Willie? I also remember his real first name, too.
Mickey asked about creating stories. I'm going to tell you that he worked again at WCHL, and I didn't know he was going to go on to such a distinguished clerical career, but because his first job that he taught me how to do was to operate the Schlitz afternoon beer party. No, but that was, I don't have any stories about the day especially, but I know that it was called Dan Moore's Wall. It was called the Chapel Hill Wall. And there was I believe there was a banner on the wall indicating the picture would tell that, but I was there in my capacity with WCHL. We were recording the event, and I wish I had those tapes.
You got the picture.
Can I just add to that? I was a fledgling reporter at WNC, so we were probably competing for the same story.
You were there, Mike.
All hail to the media. Being a journalism major, I'm going over there. Charles, yeah.
I'm Charles Thompson. I was arrested several times in these demonstrations, and I really appreciate the humor with which everyone has treated these events. But I want to recall very quickly one event when I sat in, we tried to sit in at the Tar Heel Sandwich Shop, which was just diagonally across from the jail. Felt safe being near the jail. And people saw us coming, so they locked the door. So in those circumstances, we would sit down outside. We sat down on the steps with our back to the door. And while we were sitting there, somebody opened the door and picked the clippings out of the guy who was sitting next to me, who was a 16-year-old kid from Greenville, Mississippi, who had gone around the South with SNP sitting in. We then were arrested. We then were taken to the jail, and we had agreed that we would walk down the stairs rather than being carried because the police were hurting their backs. And Chief William Blake asked John Dunn and Quentin Baker if we could walk down. So we were walking down those stairs, and this kid was right behind me, and he collapsed onto me. And they had to take him away and took him to the hospital. And he came back, and he had been taped up. That's all they could do for him. And he had several broken ribs. And so he told me what had happened, and I said some things that I won't say here about the people who had kicked him. And he looked at me sort of amazed. He looked me right in the eye, and he said, he said, they're just scared. This is 16 years old and traveling around the South. And so things that are worse than that happen in Chapel Hill. But when you talk about bravery, that person and the people, the kids from Lincoln High School are the bravest people I've ever met in my whole life.
Thank you, Charles. As Charles and others have pointed out also, when the class came back after 63, 64, it was as if none of this had happened. You know, there was just not any memory of it. The civil rights marches, the demonstrations didn't continue. This was a real moment in time. And I'm frankly very, very happy that I was in the class of 63, 64. I'm very, very happy you were in the class of 64, 65, and were able to be, even if it's on tangentially, to see what was really going on and what history was being made at that time. I was so privileged to be able to go out so many nights with Jim Wallace, including one night that Jim and I went to see Jesse Jackson lead a march in Greensboro the night before we both had final exams. And we will never forget that. I'm also grateful for a 50-year plus relationship and friendship with Karen Parker. And but just to have been here at that moment in time was absolutely a gift that came to me. I also was able to go to Washington to cover the funeral of President Kennedy on behalf of the Daily Tar Heel. And my education, in many ways, as I think Jim Wallace's was being able to work for the Daily Tar Heel. Reverend Seymour, who was at Beakley Memorial Baptist Church and who did the funeral for Dean Smith, said that had it not been for the Daily Tar Heel, they would not have any idea whatsoever was going on with the civil rights movements and the civil rights marches, because the Chapel Hill Weekly wouldn't touch it. So I want you to know that. God bless the Daily Tar Heel.
Published that, and Gary said yes, and he was, believe it or not, cited for contempt of court. And I think Gary stole us $10 because we all had to gather $100 to pay him.
And I see a gentleman in the orange shirt back there.
Yes, thank you. The mention of John Donne is my reference, and it's also in reference to the passivity, if you will, of students here at the time, of which I was one. In terms of full circle, several years later, I happened to be in Pittsburgh, working at the University of Pittsburgh, involved in various things, and had written a letter to the paper relative to housing discrimination against international students around the university. And the next day, I got a call from a very nice lady, and we were chatting, and she complimented me on the letter. We got acquainted over the phone. She found out I went to school here. Well, it was John Donne's mother. And we began chatting about what went on. And frankly, I was a very unconscious undergraduate about much of this, and had thought about this many years later and felt very bad about it and been doing various things to rectify that. So I asked, could I contact John? And we became good friends, his mother and his father. And I wrote to John, and then we had a conversation on the phone where I in effect apologized to him because of the terrible things that he was subjected to here, which ended for him, I think, in some ways tragically as well. But just to say that we came full circle, some of us. And though we were late, perhaps, to the light, many of us did and went on and saw that. And it was through the sacrifice of this gentleman and all the others that some of us sat by and were at minimally puzzled and maybe in other ways hostile to it. So things do change, and I want to thank all of you for that.
Briefly, that a book by John Ely called The Free Men. It talked about John Donne and
Quentin Baker.
Quentin Baker and I had a couple of photographs done in that. But it is interesting, the criticism that I hear at the Jackson Center. And by the way, the follow-up to what's going on, went on at St. Joseph Church, it is now called the Jackson Center. Jackson donated one of the parishioners money, and they are working on neighborhood programs and doing good work. Was that why did John Ely, who was an aide to Terry Sanders, why did John Ely only write about the two white boys, as opposed to everybody else who was much? But I commend the book to you.
Yes.
And I know it's in the library. Last time I checked, you can get a used version out of it.
I also recommend John Ealy's book, The Free Men. It's a very good account of the Chapel Hill Civil Rights struggle. I was on a panel with him a few years ago, and he explained why he wrote about John Donne in particular. John Donne and Quentin, of course, and Pat Cusick were the three leaders of the demonstrations in Chapel Hill. And though they let all the rest of us go, the people who got arrested, they sent the three of them to the chain gang. They did nothing wrong. All we did was peaceful assembly, basically. And the judge put them on a chain gang. You could get away with that back then.
You know, I'm a class of '63 member. In my sophomore year, I was in a dorm across from Woodland Gym where the basketball players mostly lived. And a couple of us were invited to a meeting just to talk to a young guy who was coming to town to talk about desegregation. And we went, about 6 of us, to the University Baptist Church and sat with a young man named Dr. Martin Luther King, who we never heard of. And I don't remember much about the evening, but I don't even think it had dawned on him yet what was about to happen in his life and all the lives that you all speak of. But it was, there was nothing controversial about the discussion. He was a not particularly loud or pontificating person. He was just a quiet guy who was talking about some of the experiences he was beginning to have in the little town of Montgomery, Alabama. Yeah.
I would like to give Dean Smith a plug. Some people don't know it, but at one point, Dean Smith got a student, black student, and took them to the Pines Restaurant.
With that preacher I was just talking about, Reverend Seymour.
Reverend Seymour, and you heard the program on Dean Smith yesterday. Reverend Seymour was there talking.
Stand up.
And Dean Smith was very much supporting the goal.
Lady back there.
I don't mean to be rude, but there are many of us that were 2-year ladies in the class, and I remember sitting in classes in which men raised their hands and women didn't. And so I don't mean to be spokesman for the women. One woman should speak on this. As an elementary school teacher from Greensboro, North Carolina, where we had things, as we seem to be having deja vu, I mean, we're having Ferguson, we're having the Middle Eastern crisis, we're having Vietnam veterans finally recognized. all these things that are coming back, it seems like now that we're very proud of the activists that we had, and some of us were, passive or not. My thing has always been in the future based on the past. Is the class of 65, who was quite, going to, in retirement, enjoy themselves, or will perhaps the class of 65 not allow some of the same shenanigans to go on with the government that are games? They're games. We listen to them now, and we're embarrassed for the ignorance, and we're listening to them, the past. And who were those leaders? And good grief, how could we have let that happen? But friends and neighbors, this is going on now. Will
Thank you very much. Good. We got about 2 minutes, 1 minute.
see everybody?
Mr. Minor, about coverage, you mentioned maybe in the community. When I went to work at WCHL, the owner of the station was Sandy O'Connor, who was also the mayor of Chapel Hill. And Jim, he's in the picture in the book of Alderman considering public accommodations law. I'm not even sure whether the mayor had a vote or if he did, how Sandy O'Connor voted on that. The point of my comment is this, which I think should be known. I was beginning a news department at WCHL when I was there, and was encouraged to cover all of these things. The debate on the law, the demonstrations, et cetera, and so on. I was never told how to go, or whether to go, or when to go, which I think is just an interesting comment on the dynamics that were in play.
I thank all of you for coming, and thank you for your comments. And remember, right now, as the lady back there said, we're going backwards. We had a voting rights law in 1965, and there are people trying to undo it for certain people. And instead of making it easier to vote, they're doing it by making it more difficult to vote. And boy, that's really, really in the spirit of patriotism. All right, thanks so much.